Hello everybody, this is Georgianne Hughes and this is The Bite Show. And tonight we're going to be talking with Paul Collins. Paul is Philip Collins' brother. And Paul Collins wrote a book called The Hidden Faces of Terrorism. And this is what we're going to be talking about with him tonight. Hi, Paul.
Hello, Georgianne.
Tell the people a little bit about yourself.
Okay. Well, as you said, I've written this book, The Hidden Face of Terrorism, and I'm also co-author with my brother Philip of another book called The Ascendancy of the Scientific Dictatorship, which we're preparing to put out an updated, revised, totally, completely expanded version of here in the very near future. We're starting to wrap up our research and our writing on that one, and I think it should be out within a month or two, not much longer. We basically have been hitting this topic hard since about 2002, writing about such topics as elite criminality and political conspiracy from a very realistic standpoint, and trying to dig through all the jungle that is out there, so to speak. You find a lot of writings nowadays that are completely sensationalistic.
Yeah.
Stuff out there talking about reptilians, everything from reptilians to even the contention that bunker buster bombs were on the planes that hit the WTC.
Yeah.
And what we tried to do is put together some research over this topic that is realistic and that the audience will find of value.
Yes.
Value and of use to them, as opposed to something that is completely going off in the trajectory of yellow journalism.
Yeah.
My experience with this topic begins all the way back when I was 17 years old. I began to read, and I had a sense at the time that something was just not right. I couldn't put my finger on it. I totally believe now that it was God giving me a spirit of discernment, giving my spirit the ability to understand that there was a layer below everything, an underlying current just below the surface of what we see going on politically, socially, economically, and I understood. I understood that things were not what they seemed at the time, but my overall knowledge, book-wise and education-wise, at that time was quite vague. Things, however, really started to change around the time I was 23, at which time I had relocated from my home in Colorado back here to where I live now in Ohio, and I started to attend a community college where a professor of mine, who was also a judge, he still is very much a judge in the area, began to educate me as to the hidden machinations behind things, as to the suppressed history that doesn't get out very often and is certainly not spoken of in the textbooks which are put out by the establishment press. Most of these large publishing companies are owned by the oligarchs. They're owned by the power elite. So you can't expect to receive 100% truth in those books. And some of these books, they're very crafty because they won't necessarily lie so much as they'll just conveniently omit. And you'll find that there are books where there are huge omissions.
Oh yes.
Lots of facts just going down the memory hole.
Yeah.
And without these facts, you cannot have a complete picture. You cannot have a complete portrait, and you will never understand why things happen the way they did, and the way they still are happening throughout history. A good example, right off the top of my head, would probably be the Great Depression. Most people don't understand why the Great Depression happened. Most people just know from the books that are out there that are used in the school system that it did happen, and that it was a very rough period, a very rough time of trial and tribulation for the people that were living then. What you end up finding out if you study beyond the books that they used to teach from in the school, and you get beyond those textbooks and begin to study some of the other sources that are out there, is that the Great Depression was not a Great Depression at all. It was a great wealth transfer.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, like what happened is they inflated the money supply to just a mind-boggling amount. Then they depressed it, crashed the whole market, and that's how we got what we got then. And I could go into that. But that's a whole other talk. But I'm just handing out the example to show how incomplete things are nowadays. But this teacher is not only a judge in the area, and I won't say his name over the air and all, but he's not only a judge in the area, he also, for a time, worked for the Central Intelligence Agency. And his work involved, he was recruited out of the Marine Corps while in Vietnam to work for the agency, and his cover was to be that he was a Canadian national that was doing trading with the indigenous population. And what he would do is he would set up shop and he would trade with MVA and VC, and he asked what he was supposed to do, and his handlers in the agency said, "Well, you're a nice guy. Talk to the people. You know, just talk and have them talk to you, and bring back what they tell you. Gather intelligence, bring it back to us." So basically, they talked to him. They'd warm up to him, and they would begin to tell him things that were of strategic value. They'd begin to tell him, well, my cousin is up on this hill over here. And, mysteriously the next day that hill got bombed.
Yeah.
And eventually he fell out of the good graces of the agency, and they spilled the beans to the MVA and let it be known to them that he was not in fact a Canadian trader at all, but instead that he was an American intelligence asset.
Oh.
And this almost led to his death. And he had a great wealth of knowledge about how the intelligence community really worked, and how politics in general really worked. And he got me going full speed on this topic. And since that time, I've been just gathering up information, soaking it up like a sponge, and trying to put it into a form that people can read and can understand and begin to equip themselves with for the period of time that we're not just going into, but that we have already entered.
Absolutely. And God bless this man that you speak of. He had cancer there for a time, and I think he's beat it, because I know he's back teaching again, and I know that he's back as a judge in the local area. And but I mean, everybody has that one teacher that impresses something upon them and inspires them in some way. And I have to say that he probably was that man for me. And this all I am now doing
so as to equip people to survive the time that we're in, to somehow make changes to the political system, and failing that, survive what's coming as a result of the political system that's being set up. Because the political system that is being set up is not sustainable and is going to lead to a tremendous collapse of society in general. I stopped saying that the New World was coming back about 5 years ago, to be quite honest with you. When those planes hit the WTC building on September 11th and hit the Pentagon, as far as I was concerned, at that point, the New World Order was no longer coming. It was here. It's here now in its infancy stages, and we are heading rapidly towards puberty of the New World Order, and we need to either cut it off or learn how to survive it while it's still around. And what people need to understand is that from the moment that it is fully locked in place, right from that moment the clock is ticking on its death, you know. And that death is either going to be one of two things. It's either going to be a collapse totally, completely of just society and civilization as it is, and then society and civilization pick up the pieces and rebuild itself. Hopefully beginning with America, which is the home of the innovator, of the inventor, of the true free thinker, of the only people in the world that have ever been free, is the American people. Or it's going to be what the Bible speaks about in the book of Revelation. And we're going to see the second coming and all. That's the way I see it. That's my personal belief coming out of what I know spiritually.
Yes.
So that's what my work is geared towards, and that's what Philip's work's geared towards. We work right now currently with a radio talk show host by the name of Michael Corbin, who broadcast out of Denver on KHNC. He used to be on the Genesis Network. He is no longer there, however. And we write for his magazine, the ACL Report. Yeah. And I would highly encourage people, I'm not just trying to play the role of a salesman here, but I would highly encourage people to subscribe to that particular publication, because I can guarantee as a writer that you're going to be getting something that is of value and will be profitable to you. And you just have to go on the net to www.4, a closer look, all one word, all lowercase, .com, foracloserlook.com, and you'll find the section there where you can subscribe to the ACL report.
Well, I have read the latest report, and I've got to tell you, it's excellent, absolutely excellent.
Thank you. I mean, that's what we just set out to do. That's what we try to do, is we try to lay everything out on the table, to strip it all bare. And that's what I hope to do tonight for your audience. What I hope to give your audience here is an information-dense presentation. The reason for that is that if I am going to put forward a contention, such as the idea that most terrorism is a state-sponsored type of terrorism, meant to induce social change, then I'm going to have to qualify that contention. For some, this may seem like drinking from a water hose, and all I can say to those people is that I hope you're thirsty, because that I'm going to go full barrel and just go down the facts as best I can.
Well, fire ahead, because, you know, if this thing gets out of hand with this New World Order, you are very aware of what the Scriptures say, where it does talk about in the Gospels. I believe that if It's so bad. These people are so evil that are doing this. Their wickedness is so great that if God did not shorten the time, there would be no flesh left alive.
That's correct. And in our new book, in the new copy of our book, the new revised, expanded version of our book, we're going to show where that particular verse of Scripture is true, because we show how the eugenical regimentation and the population control measures that have been taken over time by the oligarchs have created a certain situation where humanity faces extinction.
Yeah.
We will be on the verge of extinction because right now the planet is getting ready to experience a population implosion. You always heard about this population explosion nonsense? That's not true. That's not what's happening. Paul Ehrlich was wrong. All of the abortions, all the euthanasia, all the genocide, all of this nonsense that was carried out in the name of eugenical regimentation, that was carried out under the label of women's rights, supposedly making the world a safer place and a freer place for women by giving them abortions.
Yeah, giving them the so-called right to murder their unborn.
Yeah.
I mean, let's say exactly what it is. It's murder.
Yeah. You have to be glib and blunt about it.
Yeah.
But all of that has caused the population to experience a decline, to the point where by 2075 there will be 500 million less people. And I'm not just spouting out that number out of nowhere. That's what very authoritative demographers are now saying, including some demographers associated with, of all organizations, the United Nations.
Oh boy.
And all. The population will level out at about 9 billion, and then it's all downhill from there. There's not enough new children being born, and the children that should have been born ended up in a dumpster behind an abortion clinic, to be quite glib and honest. And so the population is starting to implode. This means tremendous impact on the economic vitality of all the different nation states, who have to somehow keep their social programs and their retirement programs and their pension programs afloat. And they can't now, especially in particular the United States. The Social Security Fund has been looted to the point where boomers are not going to be able to retire. And the problem is that every day of this year, every day of 2006, a boomer will turn 60 years old and all. So they're that close to retirement age. And the fund is insolvent, and the people that were going to generate the revenue to take care of that insolvency were not even given the opportunity to be born. So we're going to experience what is called the graying of society, where society is by and large mostly older people, kind of a reverse version of that movie Logan's Run.
Yeah.
And we're also going to experience insolvency and a loss of economic vitality for all the different nation states. And Europe is on the way out. I mean, you hear a lot about the European Union being the juggernaut that's going to totally take on the American empire. Forget about it. By the middle of this century, their part of the world economic system is going to shrink from 20% to 10%, and that is in large measure because They just don't have a future generation being born. There are not enough children being born. They're being lost to eugenical regimentation, to sterilization, to population control measures, to abortion, to birth control, and also they're being lost because that whole continent has taken a shift towards atheism, and they have no hope for the future. And when there is a very low birth rate, that tells us that the overall psychology of the people, the overall mentality of the people contains a hopelessness and no hope for the future. When you don't have any kind of hope for the future, as a Christian would, if you have no hope for the future as a Christian would, then there is no point in having children. And that's where atheism has taken them. That's where socialism, secularism has taken them. And but I'm getting off topic and all. But I was just backing up what you were saying.
You're right. You're absolutely right. And I want to ask a question about this. Is it possible, Paul, that they mapped this out a long time ago about, making abortion popular? They run around screaming about overpopulation, but is it possible that those that are in the so-called star chambers understand and have promoted these things?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. They have been promoting these things.
But they knowingly, concerning population, that it would dwindle into what you're talking about.
I don't know if they intended for it to lead to the kind of cataclysm that I'm describing.
Okay.
I think my personal opinion is that the reason they have been conducting this eugenical campaign is the purpose of it is to create the perfect man, to help humanity reach apotheosis. They were hoping to weed out all of the unfit and to create what Hitler called the Aryan, what was known in communist Russia as the Soviet man, what Nietzsche called the Übermensch, the perfect human being. And that the unintentional consequences of that project has been what we see now, where more than 60 countries now have below the level of birth rate that is desired. Over 60 countries, in other words, have a low birth rate, and because they cannot lose their economic systems yet. They can't lose their political systems. They can't lose the political stability of the various nations yet, because they need that to build, to be integrated into the larger global system that they have in mind.
Okay.
And if it's all falling apart prior to that, then you have nothing that you can really,
So would this, excuse me for interrupting, but
no.
Could this be why they are inviting in all the people of the third world into America?
Well, I'll tell you what I believe as far as the immigration goes. And we've done a very large report over illegal immigration.
Okay.
Over the illegal immigrants and the anti-immigration movement, and how those two are being played off of one another in racial dialectic camps.
Yeah.
And perhaps at some later date we can set up a time to actually do a show with both Philip and myself on there to talk about that report we did, because it is a very, very important topic. But I'll tell you what I think. It's not so much that these people are of a different color, and it's not so much that these people are illegal aliens or that they are alien people. The problem is that they enter with alien philosophies.
Haha, yes, bingo.
Foreign philosophies
yes.
that run contradictory to the Constitution and the Freedom Documents. They run contradictory to the Federalist Papers. They run contradictory to the Bill of Rights. Most of these people have known for all of their natural lives, from the time that they were in the cradle, a socialist system of some sort. And that is what they will seek to build here in the United States if they don't go through if they don't go through the process of being Americanized, if they don't acquaint themselves with the Constitution and with the Bill of Rights and educate themselves as to what those say, and then agree to go along with that and thus become a productive part of our society. And the problem is that they're coming in droves and in hordes, and they are not, and they're bringing alien philosophies with them, and they're not being Americanized, and they're going to start trying to realize these subversive ideas in the midst of our society. And that's already begun with the al-Qaeda movement. The al-Qaeda movement holds that all of the Southwest United States used to be the ancient Aztec kingdom, and they want to go on a campaign of reconquista, which means reconquer. They want to conquer it all again and take the southwestern United States and make it part of a new Aztec kingdom, a new Chicano nation, racialist enclave, if you will.
Yeah.
And that's what the goal is of a lot of these guys. Certainly not of little Juan or Jaime, 17, 18-year-old boy that comes over here from Tijuana, because his father is an impoverished market worker who's been having heart problems, and so he now has to take over trying to help the family, and he goes and works in the fields there in Ventura County in California. Certainly not him. Not every illegal immigrant that's over here believes that way, but there is a hardcore group of them that do.
Yes, you're right.
One group that comes right to mind is this bloody group called the Mera Salvatrucha 13, MS-13.
Yes.
It is probably the most vicious street gang, going from being a street gang, actually evolving from that to being a transnational kind of organized crime syndicate.
Yes.
But it's the most dangerous one in the world today. And I really don't think it any exaggeration to say that I see some kind of sparring between them and the Minutemen that will involve the trading of gunfire and a lot of killing as a result.
Yeah.
But that's my take on the illegal immigration issue, and we can go into that, of course, at a later date in detail, and we'll send along a copy of that the article that we did for the ACL report to you concerning that topic.
Okay, great. Well, let's move ahead with our faces, the hidden faces of terrorism. This is fascinating, folks. Wait till you hear this. Go ahead.
Sure. Well, our modern world is full of man-made myths that are intended to cover up discomforting truths. And one such myth is the contention that the sole perpetrators of terrorism are disenfranchised misfits that are on the fringe of society. And one of the foremost supporters of this contention is one Professor Mark Juergensmeyer. He looks solely at the visible perpetrators. He does not look at the patrons of terrorism, which is a little caveat to this discussion. I'm kind of surprised to find that William H. Kennedy, who is an excellent researcher who has done two very important books over Satanism, Lucifer's Lodge and Satanism Threaten the New Millennium, and I strongly suggest that people go out, find copies of those books, read them, and pass them along. But I'm very surprised to find that he actually supports Mark Juergensmeyer and has had him on his show and finds him to be an authority. But that's a caveat. It's neither here nor there, but I thought I'd throw that in. Juergensmeyer does not look at the patrons of terrorism. Who gives these groups the financial support they need, the logistical support, the technological support? In other words, who is the shepherds that watch over the herd of radicals? Juergensmeyer doesn't look at that. Instead, in my book, I look at some of Juergensmeyer's flawed ideas. In an article that he wrote, I can't recall the name offhand. Well, let me see. I got it. Understanding the New Terrorism. This article that he wrote for an educational periodical. He stated that terrorism appears pointless since it does not lead directly to any strategic goal. And then he just says that it's a bunch of religious nuts out there. And he leaves it at that. Yeah. Well, remember the Wizard of Oz? Remember the wizard hiding behind the curtain, telling everyone to ignore the man behind the curtain?
Oh, yes.
Well, survival dictates. Yeah. Survival dictates that you and I strip away the curtain. Juergensmeyer does not allow us to do that, given his analysis. Yeah. And the way that he feels is the way that most of Orthodox academia feels. Most of Orthodox academia relegates terrorism to the realm of just disenfranchised misfits that are on the fringe of society, and they do not look at the hidden backers of these different groups. They don't look at the backers of al-Qaeda. They don't look at those who backed the Nazis, who did come to power through terrorism. The Reichstag burning was almost certainly conducted by the Nazis to help Hitler elevate himself to the position of authority that he ended up having, thus leading to the end of the Weimar Republic and the emergence of the Nazi dictatorship. Well, as far as I'm concerned, Father Ignacio Morton-Boro, a social psychologist who's deceased now, contributed to the process of stripping away the curtain when he stated in his speech, The Psychological Consequences of Political Terror, that the most significant form of terrorism, by a large measure, is state-sponsored. Now, while he was referring to the visible enforcement arms that make up a country's national security apparatus, I hold that state terrorism can be carried out by proxy through surrogates, and you'll see that as we go along. Martin Boro's definition also holds that state terrorism is part of a government-imposed socio-political project. In other words, it is social engineering, which is the conscious changing of a target population's social values. Through a manufactured crisis, one can induce social change. And this strategy has been recycled over and over again, but it's the oldest game in the book. One individual who spoke about it was Jan Kozak. and he wrote a book called "And Not a Shot Fired." And he described the process as being what he called revolutionary parliamentarianism, or the pincer movement. Now, basically, what the revolutionary parliamentarianism calls for is first having your people infiltrate the government, and they're going to become pressure from above. Then you go to the second step, and you either look around and find a real grievance that you can exaggerate and use to your own advantage, or you create a grievance. You can create the grievance by perpetrating an act of terrorism, or by creating a situation of government paralysis. That's what we saw during 9/11. We saw a large part of the national security apparatus that was supposed to prevent the attacks from happening being switched off. Robert Wright of the Federal Bureau of Investigation had an investigation going into al-Qaeda. He found his investigation squelched by his superior. Colleen Rowley, another individual with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, was trying to investigate and found her investigations frustrated by the authority above her. And lo and behold, both of their investigations and about 3 other investigations into al-Qaeda were being frustrated and thwarted by the same man, Dave Frasca, who was the head of the radical fundamentalist unit at the FBI.
Oh boy.
And the funny thing is that after 9/11, Dave Frasca did not find himself out of a job. He found himself promoted.
Wow.
But that's what I'm talking about here is you either perpetrate the terrorist act yourself, or you know that one is coming, or you know that some kind of crisis is on the way that the government has the power to stop, and you induce government paralysis, and you by just causing those arms of the government that are supposed to react to go into inaction. You sit on them. You keep them from doing their jobs and doing it well. We saw this back during Hurricane Katrina. the groups that were supposed to be down there were not there when Katrina struck, and they knew that a Category 5 hurricane was on the way. And Michael Brown ended up being the sacrificial lamb for that one. But
and isn't it interesting, Paul, that during a talk that George Bush gave, he referred to the hurricane as an awesome weapon of destruction?
Yeah, exactly.
People don't seem to have picked up on that.
No. Mm-mm. Mm-mm. But George Bush was very much responsible because he had cut the funding to deal with that kind of a situation, even though he had been told that a Category 5 hurricane would lead to that area pretty much being demolished. His reaction to that information was to cut the funding, ostensibly to fund his war in Iraq. So, I mean, there you go.
Yeah.
But anyways, on to step 3. Step 3 is where the people that created the grievance, they end up being pressured by a mob. A mob forms and constitutes pressure from below. And that mob is usually led by demagogues that are merely taking advantage of a situation, and they begin to pressure those above to do something about the situation by increasing the amount of government control, by increasing government growth. They basically demand for the government to solve the problem by way of authoritarian measures. The fourth step is where the people in government oblige the mob, oblige the pressure from below by basically putting out oppressive legislation. And that oppressive legislation we saw shortly after September 11th in the form of the Patriot Act, which made radical changes to how to a FISA warrant and how one can get a FISA warrant and how FISA warrants, who they apply to. It used to be that FISA warrants could only be obtained for suspected spies and terrorists.
Right.
Patriot Act changed the language so that a FISA warrant could basically be picked up, could be obtained to surveil people who are not suspected terrorists and who are not spies.
And what also is interesting, the word terrorist can be applied to almost anyone in this country for any reason.
Under the new definition, that's correct.
Yeah.
Under the new definition, that is certainly the case.
Yeah.
But anyways, the fifth step is to basically repeat the last four steps. And you keep on doing that over and over and over again. And the pincers tighten around the neck of the people more and more until they clamp down. And you go from having a constitutional republic such as we have to having some kind of dictatorship, whether it be fascist or communist in nature. So we've seen this whole process come about with September 11th when the al-Qaeda terrorist network was created. Most people don't understand that the story of al-Qaeda does not necessarily begin with Osama bin Laden. I begin it at least in my book with a man known as Zbigniew Brzezinski.
Yes.
He was President Carter's national security advisor. Mm-hmm. And he was the first director of the Trilateral Commission. And he wrote a book in 1997 known as The Grand Chessboard. And in that book, he provides readers with the motivation for the creation of the terrorist threat that we know as al-Qaeda. In that book, he basically celebrates the fact that America is becoming a world empire. But while he celebrates this fact, he also says that there is a distinct threat to America's ascendancy to the position of being an empire. He says, quote, "The attitude of the American public towards the external projection of American power has become more ambivalent," unquote. So the people's aversion towards imperialistic policies, which Brzezinski refers to as ambivalence, is now standing in the way of the empire expanding. So Brzezinski goes about suggesting some way of taking care of this obstacle. He says in his book, quote, "The public supported America's engagement in World War II largely because of the shock effect of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor," unquote. So what he's suggesting is that you can get mass consensus through mass trauma.
Well, now, there's a lot of people out there that believe, and it is not unreasonable to believe that this government would bomb something in this country to create what you're talking about.
Yeah, well,
you know.
But if you look, when you look at that statement, it's so suggestive. I mean,
oh yes.
I mean, why refer back to Pearl Harbor? Pearl Harbor was what essentially got America. It brought about America's entry into World War II.
Yeah.
And it took something that massive to get the American people to go along with entering what was, for the most part, a European war at the time. And by America entering, they did that with the Lusitania as well in the First World War. But by getting America to enter, that European war transformed and mutated into a truly global conflict. But anyways, Brzezinski then makes a very damning confession later on in the book. He says, quote, "Moreover, as America becomes an increasingly multicultural society, it may find it more difficult to fashion a consensus on foreign policy issues except in the circumstance of a truly massive and widely perceived direct external threat." So what he's basically saying here is that the solution to the problem, the way to get mass consensus behind bringing America out of its Republican shell and transforming it into an empire, is to have a readily exploitable menace. And Brzezinski had already begun building that. He had begun the construction of this direct external threat years before he had even written the book. This was revealed in an interview that he had given with a French magazine. What was revealed basically in this interview was that both he and Robert Gates, who was the former director of the Central Intelligence Agency, had gone through with plans where America's intelligence services were sending aid to the Mujahideen rebels that were in Afghanistan 6 months prior to the Soviet invasion.
Oh boy.
And the reason for this, the reason that they did this, was because they understood that by sending the aid and making these rebels actually a threat to the government there in Kabul, it would entice the Soviet Union to invade Afghanistan. And after they encouraged the Soviets to invade Afghanistan, Brzezinski now had a pretext for the radicalizing and arming of a population. And this population would fight the Soviets and give the Soviets their version of Vietnam, but they would also be used at a future date as a potential enemy to the United States.
Yes.
And the radicalization process was very insidious and involved brainwashing of children under the guise of education. And this was brought out by the Washington Post, and I have to tip my hat here to Joe Stevens and David B. Ottaway, who reported about this. They reported that textbooks were prepared for children over there, and that these textbooks were sent over and supplied to Afghan school children, and the United States spent millions of dollars on these textbooks, and these textbooks were filled with violent images, and these books also had militant Islamic teachings in them.
Well, now, I've got a question here. A thought just occurred to me. Who is actually pushing and behind the radical Wahhabi movement?
Well, to tell you the truth, what I see behind it is that we we radicalized these people.
Okay.
We basically took a dormant form of Islam that had as I was saying, it's dormant. It was dormant. It was not active for hundreds of years, and caused it to reawaken by getting these books out to Afghan school children.
Oh, geez.
And these books were filled with talk of jihad. They had pictures of guns. They had pictures of bullets, soldiers, and mines. And these books became part of the Afghan school system's core curriculum. And even the Taliban ended up using these books. But the books had been developed with a grant from USAID, which is the U.S. Agency for International Development. And that grant...
Oh, boy. International... Oh, my gosh, international development. Okay.
Yeah.
That's a good one. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the Agency for International Development has been involved in a lot of very nefarious things that have been going on. Not just this project. We'll speak to this project right now, but I'll just say that they have been criticized in the past for being involved in several other very shady kind of dealings that we could probably speak of later on in another talk.
Okay.
But the grant that they gave went to the University of Nebraska and to the University of Nebraska Omaha's Center for Afghanistan Studies. And the Agency for International Development ended up spending $51 million on this program from about 1984 to 1994.
When these books were being put together, didn't someone feel like, coming out and saying something about it?
Well, I know that the material was just so blatant that I'm surprised it didn't turn more than a few heads.
Yeah.
For instance, children were taught to count with pictures of tanks. They were taught to count with pictures of missiles, of landmines.
Yeah.
And you have to understand that a child's mind is very impressionable.
You bet.
A child is a sponge. They soak up everything. And when you give them pictures and say, well, how many tanks plus how many Kalashnikovs does it take to do this or that, they're going to soak that up, and they're going to take in the violent elements of that. I'll give you a quote from one of the Afghan textbooks. It says, quote, "A Kalashnikov bullet travels at 800 meters per second. A Mujahid has the forehead of a Russian in his sights 3,200 meters away. How many seconds will it take the bullet to hit the Russian's forehead?" Unquote.
And in the meantime, they're teaching kids in this country to put condoms on cucumbers.
Yeah, yeah. I know.
Oh my God!
It's bizarre. It's bizarre. But what's the problem? While it's violence there and it's licentiousness here, there's still a commonality to it all, and that is the blowing away of any moral standards, taking morality out of any judgment call or any decision, and just going to a total system of moral relativism.
Right.
And the way that you can basically define insanity is one who does not know the difference between right and wrong any longer.
There's a lot of examples of that around today.
Yeah, but unfortunately, the insanity is what's being taught to children who are the most impressionable.
Yes, you're right.
If I, at 32 years of age, could take a look at one of these books and say, this is wrong. Something's wrong with this.
Yeah.
And all. A single-digit age school child, it would look at these books and not be able to make that same kind of judgment call.
You're right.
And all. But that social engineering project was successful in transforming Muslim children into conscienceless killers. And many of those kids would go on to join al-Qaeda, which was the terrorist network that was headed up by Osama bin Laden. And bin Laden, of course, many people know, is the heir to a Saudi construction fortune. And he had gone to Afghanistan in 1979 to fight the Soviets. And bin Laden had eventually rose through the ranks and became the head of a group called the Maktab al-Qaeda, also known as the MAK, or the MAC. And this front organization was basically it was basically put together and financed by the Central Intelligence Agency through a surrogate organization, through Pakistani ISI, the Inter-Service Intelligence Agency, basically Pakistan's equivalent of the Central Intelligence Agency. What many people don't realize is that the head of Pakistani ISI has to be approved by the American CIA's DCI, Director of Central Intelligence. So Pakistani ISI was merely a surrogate organization for the CIA, and the CIA was using the ISI to nurture the MAK, bin Laden's organization.
Isn't bin Laden, didn't he have business dealings with the Clintons and the Bushes?
Well, I do know that he definitely had dealings with the Bushes.
Okay.
The Bushes were involved in a group called the Carlyle Group.
Yes.
And the Carlyle Group, I believe, did have bin Laden involvement in it. And if I do recall correctly, bin Laden money went into George W. Bush's first oil company, Arbusto Energy, received money from the bin Laden family. Clinton is an interesting case. I'm not too sure if Clinton was involved in any direct kind of business dealings with the bin Ladens, but whether he was or wasn't, he's still connected in the respect that the same people that were behind George Bush were behind Bill Clinton.
Yes.
And let me qualify that statement. Bill Clinton was introduced to elite political circles back in 1990 by a woman named Pamela Harriman. Pamela Harriman was the widow of Averill Harriman.
Yes.
Averill Harriman and Prescott Bush had been involved in putting together what was called the Union Banking Corporation, which was the front for Fritz Thyssen, who was Hitler's main financial bagman here in the States. And in 1942, it was eventually shut down under the Trading with the Enemies Act by the United States government. But that's how Clinton got in, was through Averill Harriman's widow. That's how he got his foot in the door and began to connive with the power elite, so to speak. A person that helped him run for governor and got the campaign money for him is a good friend of the Bush family named Jackson Stevens.
Yes.
So it connects. It connects in that respect. It connects from Clinton to Bush to Bin Laden in that way. And in my book, I do point out that Sudan wanted to give us Bin Laden and knew where bin Laden was and would offered him up to Bill Clinton, and Bill Clinton declined the offer.
Yeah, I know.
You know, there was a nonpartisan aegis looking over this guy.
Both Bill and Hillary are in this up to their necks.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And now I will say there is some real honest to God factionalism that goes on, where there is actual fighting between elites. But the problem is that no matter which group of elites wins the turf war, an elite faction has won. Therefore, the precepts of elitism and oligarchy remain firmly intact at the top. And so that's where the problem lies.
Right.
If Kerry, people should have no illusions about the 2004 election. If Kerry had won, we would be in just as much dire straits as we are under Bush.
Oh yeah.
Kerry would have followed the more traditional Richard Gardner script towards world government. Richard Gardner had written for the Foreign Affairs magazine an article called The Hard Road to World Order, where he suggested a slow, gradual, piecemeal process involving treaties and involving different international organizations towards world government. Bush too has opted for a more imperialistic approach to getting towards world government. Yeah. The problem is that whether it's Clinton, or Kerry rather, whether it's Kerry or Bush, the end result would be the same, world government.
Yes.
You know.
Yeah.
So, bit of a caveat, a bit off, I guess, but still, I get in another aspect, I see it as applying to the discussion at hand. Anyways, bin Laden ended up at the end of 1989, when the Afghan war ended. He ended up being still viewed by the CIA as something of a hero. And something that I found very peculiar, and I put this in the book, is the fact that the CIA knew about, in the mid-1980s, the fact that there was this deepening crisis of infrastructure within the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was falling apart. It was keeping up a good cosmetic front, but behind the scenes, it was just starting to fall to pieces. And the Robert Gates, who was at one time the DCI, admitted to Congress in 1992 that the CIA had kept evidence from President Reagan that suggested that the Soviet Union was crumbling, and instead told him that the Soviet military was basically a juggernaut, and they exaggerated Soviet strength, and they made it sound like their military and technological capabilities were on par with the United States. And that raises a very troubling question. If the Soviet Union was going to collapse with or without bin Laden, and if bin Laden's involvement in the crusade against the Soviets was irrelevant and would not bring about the demise of communism because communism was going to fall anyways, then why keep funding him? Why lie to President Reagan? Why cook the books in their annual Soviet military power report right up to 1990 and lie so that they could keep giving this man money? Bin Laden continued to receive funds in spite of the fact that he was totally obsolete when it came to the crusade against communism. This seems to suggest that there were other reasons for funding this man and keeping this man's organization and network alive, that had nothing to do with communism and had to do with creating a pretext for a move later down the tracks and all. Understand that the Central Intelligence Agency don't improvise. They don't do things on a whim. They have plans that they set in motion 10 and 20 years ahead of the actual bringing things to fruition.
And sometimes further ahead than that.
Yeah.
Let's bring this particular segment to a close, and we will go on to part 2.
Sure.
Okay, Paul. Hold on just a second. You've been listening to Georgianne Hughes with my special guest, Paul Collins, and we are talking about the hidden faces of terrorism. And we are moving on right now to part 2.
Okay.
Yeah.
And without these facts, you cannot have a complete picture. You cannot have a complete portrait, and you will never understand why things happen the way they did, and the way they still are happening throughout history. A good example, right off the top of my head, would probably be the Great Depression. Most people don't understand why the Great Depression happened. Most people just know from the books that are out there that are used in the school system that it did happen, and that it was a very rough period, a very rough time of trial and tribulation for the people that were living then. What you end up finding out if you study beyond the books that they used to teach from in the school, and you get beyond those textbooks and begin to study some of the other sources that are out there, is that the Great Depression was not a Great Depression at all. It was a great wealth transfer.
Yes, absolutely.
What happened is they inflated the money supply to just a mind-boggling amount. Then they depressed it, crashed the whole market, and that's how.
Hello, everybody. This is Georgianne Hughes, and this is The P.L.A.Y.N.O.W. Show. And tonight we're going to be talking with Paul Collins. Paul is Philip Collins' brother. And Paul Collins wrote a book called The Hidden Faces of Terrorism. And this is what we're going to be talking about with him tonight. Hi, Paul.
Hello, Georgianne.
Tell the people a little bit about yourself.
Okay. Well, as you said, I've written this book, The Hidden Face of Terrorism, and I'm also co-author with my brother Philip of another book called The Ascendancy of the Scientific Dictatorship, which we're preparing to put out an updated, revised, totally, completely expanded version of here in the very near future. We're starting to wrap up our research and our writing on that one, and I think it should be out within a month or two, not much longer. We basically have been hitting this topic hard since about 2002, writing about such topics as elite criminality and political conspiracy from a very realistic standpoint, and trying to dig through all the jungle that is out there. So we got what we got then, and I could go into that. But that's a whole other talk. But I'm just handing out the example to show how incomplete things are nowadays. But this teacher is not only a judge in the area, and I won't say his name over the air and all, but he's not only a judge in the area, he also, for a time, worked for the Central Intelligence Agency. And his work involved, he was recruited out of the Marine Corps while in Vietnam to work for the agency, and his cover was to be that he was a Canadian national that was doing trading with the indigenous population. And what he would do is he would set up shop and he would trade with MVA and VC, and he asked what he was supposed to do, and his handlers in the agency said, "Well, you're a nice guy. Talk to the people. You know, just talk and have them talk to you and bring back what they tell you. Gather intelligence, bring it back to us." So basically, they'd talk to him, they'd warm up to him, and they would begin to tell him things that were of strategic value. They'd begin to tell him, "Well, my cousin is up on this hill over here." You find a lot of writings nowadays that are completely sensationalistic. Stuff out there talking about reptilians, everything from reptilians to even the contention that bunker buster bombs were on the planes that hit the WTC. Yeah. And what we tried to do is put together some research over this topic that is realistic and that the audience will find of value. Value and of use to them, as opposed to something that is completely going off in the trajectory of yellow journalism. Yeah. My experience with this topic begins all the way back when I was 17 years old. I began to read, and I had a sense at the time that something was just not right. I couldn't put my finger on it. I totally believe now that it was God giving me a spirit of discernment, giving my spirit the ability to understand that there was a layer below everything, an underlying current just below the surface of what we see going on politically, socially, economically, and I understood. I understood that things were not what they seemed at the time, but my overall knowledge, book-wise and education-wise, at that time was quite vague. Things, however, really started to change around the time I was 23, at which time I had relocated from my home in Colorado back here to where I live now in Ohio, and I started to attend a community college where a professor of mine, who was also a judge, he still is very much a judge in the area, began to educate me as to the hidden machinations behind things, as to the suppressed history that doesn't get out very often and is certainly not spoken of in the textbooks which are put out by the establishment press. Most of these large publishing companies are owned by the oligarchs. They're owned by the power elite. So you can't expect to receive 100% truth in those books. And some of these books they're very crafty because they won't necessarily lie so much as they'll just conveniently omit. And you'll find that there are books where there are huge omissions. Oh yes. Lots of facts just going down the memory hole.